Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today I have a very special guest. I have Stephen Feinstein, who is the author of the book We Destroy Arguments, How Presuppositional Apologetics Empowers the Believer to Refute Unbelief. And so I'm very excited to have our guest here tonight. By the time we're recording this, what are we, 9:02 Eastern time. I'm excited to have him on here, and have greatly benefited from this book myself. I highly recommend folks pick it up. And if you don't have time to sit down and read it, I think it's available on Audible. So whether it's the physical book or the Audible, I think it has like a virtual reader, which is pretty good. I highly recommend folks check that out. But without further ado, let me introduce Stephen Feinstein. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining me. Can you introduce yourself and maybe tell folks a little bit more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me, Eli. I am honored to be on your podcast. And so as Eli said, I am Stephen Feinstein. I'm a pastor. I'm currently one of the pastors of Sovereign Way Christian Church in Hesperia, California, which is about an hour and a half northeast of Los Angeles. This is a church that I helped plant in 2010. And eventually it grew, and now it is my employer. I'm also a chaplain in the United States Army Reserves. I hold the rank of lieutenant colonel. I'm hoping to pick up colonel within the next year. That'll be pretty cool. So I get to do some pretty cool stuff with the Army. It's a very unique ministry opportunity. You might be able to tell by my last name that I'm Jewish, and that is something that is near and dear to me. That the Lord has made all these promises, and they came to fulfillment in Christ. And through Messiah, the nations are being ingathered into these promises, and we have a great eschatological future coming. And so, yeah, I love nerding out on those things. Apologetics is a bit of a hobby for me. My higher education wasn't specifically in apologetics. I'm more of a New Testament scholar wannabe, and I just say wannabe because I don't have a PhD yet, but I have every possible degree you could have before that. Um, but what I do week in, week out is I exegete New Testament passages. I translate the Greek. I do the deep dive on the historical and geographical studies, and then I bring the word of God to the people God's entrusted to me. That being said, you may have heard the phrase, wherever you have two Jews, you have three opinions. Um, it's in our it's in our nature to be argumentative and to debate. And so I love debate, and I've always been drawn to apologetics. Since the moment I became a believer at 17 years old, I was already getting into debates with people, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing at first.
Mm.
So later on, I had a buddy. His name's Jim Cathan. He really he's the guy who first brought me into a reformed soteriology. And I don't know if he's listening, but if he is, Dr. James White, your book Potter's Freedom was foundational in that journey for me. And so
That's
once
cool.
I entered the space of reformed soteriology, then my friend Jim Cathan respectfully challenged me to get away from evidentialism. And given that I was a history major undergrad, I'm like, no, it's all about the evidence. But he kept pestering me until I read Van Til's Defense of the Faith.
Mm.
And after I read Defense of the Faith, I'm like, okay, I'm convinced. But now that I'm done reading this, I don't know how to do it. I'm convinced you have to do this. This is the right way, but I don't at all understand how to actually practically do this. So I read it again and understood it more, but still didn't know how to do it. Then I read Bonson, and that's when I started getting a little bit of okay, this is how it could be done. But even after Bonson, even after Frame, even after Pratt and William Edgar and Poitras and Oliphant, after all of them, I still felt that although they have filled my mind with some great insights in how to defend the faith in a way that honors God, I still felt like there was no practical, this is how you do it.
Mm.
And so, given that I was a teacher by trade, one thing that I am okay at is taking other people's ideas and synthesizing them in a kind of in a pedagogical way where it could be distilled in a way that makes sense, that gives you the content, but then gives you the application. And
Sure.
so that's the whole point of my book. There's nothing original in there. I wasn't trying to invent anything. I was trying to take the great information that has been put out there by others and trying to make it a little more accessible in a single volume
Mm.
for um, people that I wish there would have been a book like that when I was first coming into presuppositional
Yeah, that's
apologetics.
exactly what I was thinking when I was reading through your book. I'm like, golly, this is something I probably should have written a long time ago. It's probably the topics I would have covered and probably the way I would have written it. So there you go. Again, highly recommend. So I would agree with you, Stephen, that I love reading Van Til, although he can be challenging. I love reading Bonson. I love reading other presuppositionalists, but it is very difficult to find a specific example of what it actually looks like. And when you do find instances where people are using it and using it quote unquote well online, they sometimes the people tend to be jerks, and then that kind of undercuts the cool, practical example that they provided for us. So again, I really appreciate the angle that you took in writing this book. Now, you have the book broken up into two sections. Section 1 being building the apologetic, and section 2 applying the apologetic. I want to talk a little bit about your first section. Chapter 1 is entitled The Theology of Apologetics. Why is it important to derive your apologetics from your theology?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we all say we believe in Second Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, that all scripture is theonoustos, breathed out by God, and that it is useful, right? It's useful for four things according to that verse. It is useful for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, and for training in righteousness, so that the man of God would be complete and equipped for every good work. And so when you think about exactly what that's saying, right, it says four things, but it's really talking about two things.
Hmm.
The teaching and the rebuking are two sides of one coin. The word of God teaches you what to think rightly, what to believe rightly, and it rebukes the
Hmm.
things that we're not supposed to believe. The false doctrine, idolatry, whatever it may be. So it teaches us what's right and rebukes what's wrong. Okay, so that's up here and in here. But then the second part is the next two words, corrects and trains. That has to deal with our behavior. That has to deal with how we live. So it corrects us away from sinful things that are contrary to God's nature, contrary to his law. And it trains us then in righteousness, trains us to live in a way that is in agreement with our justification, right? And in so doing, we become complete and equipped for every good work, including apologetics. And so if it's the word of God that teaches me what to think right and corrects the wrong things, gets rid of those out of my mind, meaning it shapes my worldview, and then it gives me what I need to actually conduct myself correctly, and apologetics is one of those works that we're called to do, then it has to be built on the theology that is given to us through the special revelation
Hmm.
we find in the Bible. So to me, it's a logical necessity, but it was something that was not obvious to me until somebody pointed it out.
Sure. Dr. Greg Bonson was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bonson U. Bonson U aims to bring seminary level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bonson. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bonson U Plus and Bonson U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. Now, when we read, for example, Van Til's little book, Christian Apologetics, there's an entire section on systematic theology. Can you, if you remember, can you unpack the role of systematic theology in creating or kind of establishing the foundation for apologetics? How does systematic theology give us kind of the pillars that undergird the way in which we defend the faith and the content of the faith that we're defending?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, short answer, right? Systematic theology, I don't this is where I could be tempted to nerd out, right?
Well,
In
please
my
do.
heart of
People
hearts,
who listen to this channel, they want to hear the nerdy stuff. So
So in my heart of hearts, I'm a biblical theologian. I think systematic theology depends on biblical theology. And when I say biblical theology, I'm not talking about biblical studies, nor am I talking like just being generic, a theology that's biblical. Everybody thinks they have that. No, I believe the one ring to rule them all is from Genesis to Revelation. The word progresses in such a way that we are given types, shadows, patterns, and paradigms that keep growing and growing throughout Scripture, bringing us to the archetype, Jesus, right? And so that frames everything of how we're supposed to understand the Scriptures. Now, it's hard to bring that up in apologetics because really what we're hitting is the meta narrative.
Right.
So systematic theology is useful because what it is it's the summary statement on categories of doctrine. The caution I would give is the scripture doesn't give us a systematic theology. The authors of scripture weren't thinking in terms of systematic theology, but Christians who reflect upon the complete canon that's been given to us, what we've done. And I think part of this stems from being steeped in Aristotle's way of categorizing things is we've determined that various things need to be set in their categories. So we have the doctrine of God. Let's have a summary of everything the Bible says about that. And then the doctrine of Christ, Christology, the doctrine of the word, bibliology. And so systematic theology, really what it does is it gives us the 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 total summary explanation of all the doctrines. It's abstracted from the meta narrative that we get it from, but at the same time, if it's done right, it accurately describes what we believe about all these various subjects.
Mm.
And the reason why this is important for presuppositional apologetics is because Van Til was very insightful to realize that we are not defending pieces of a worldview, we're defending the worldview as a unit.
Right.
And one of the best ways to articulate our worldview is with the summary explanation of our doctrines, which comes from systematic theology.
Which should be rooted in the more fundamental biblical category. So when you use biblical
Correct.
theology, you're speaking about like the category of like there's systematic theology, there's pragmatic theology, then there's biblical theology, which kind of follows the covenantal narrative from creation to the end. Is that's what you're talking about in terms of biblical theology, right?
Yeah, that the Bible has its own logic in how it gets us from the beginning of the meta narrative to the end, and
Mm,
how it introduces along the way all sorts of types, shadows, institutions. That really the way you can liken it is it's like a ladder,
mm,
and so throughout redemptive history, you have various pegs on the ladder, which are repetitions of these earlier patterns or types that come up, but they're all pointing us to the eschatological finale, if you will.
yeah,
And of course, that's why it all points to Christ. He is the volume of scriptures about him, because when it comes to most things, he is the top peg on that ladder,
right, right.
both in terms of his first coming and his second coming. And so, I think the danger in systematic theology, if it's divorced from that, is there is the temptation to take these passages from their context and rip them out of what they're saying in light of the redemptive narrative where you find it,
Mm,
and really just abstracting it and turning it into a type of scholasticism that is divorced from the scripture itself.
right.
So that's why I think systematic theology, it's very useful. I've taught it at my church twice already. My most current version was 150 lectures, and
Wow.
so it's obviously something I want people to know.
Sure.
It has to be tethered to the scriptures.
Yeah, I think I like how you said that. So because a lot of people can treat systematic theology as kind of like there are these doctrines that go in this one bucket, like anthropology, and then there's this other doctrines go in this other bucket, soteriology. But never shall the buckets meet. There's no undergirding string that ties them together because a lot of people who do systematic theology don't do it with the backdrop of knowledge of biblical theology and that overall overarching narrative or meta narrative, as you mentioned. So I think that's super important. I think the value of systematic theology. I think I was anticipating you saying it because I knew you were going to go there because us presuppositionalists we're on the same wavelength. I knew you were going to mention Van Til's focus on the defense of Christian theism as a unit. And I think that's where the systematic theology comes into play because it emphasizes the importance of understanding the interrelation between doctrines. We're not just talking about the doctrine of Christ independent of the atonement or the Trinity or anything along those lines. And so I think it's very important for people to understand the system of Christian truth. But absolutely, biblical theology, I think, is a neglected area. Do you have a favorite biblical theologian, someone who does biblical? Are you like a Gerhardus Voss kind of guy, or like where do you stand in terms
No.
of your influences there?
Yeah, that's kinda tough. So, my Master of Divinity I got from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I have to emphasize the definite article there because Al Mohler does. Um, and the thing is, I would say that biblical theology, at least in Baptist circles, is strongest there. So
Mhm.
having great professors like Jim Hamilton, Tom Schreiner, they're strong on New Testament. Dwayne Garrett was strong on Old Testament. There was just a lot of biblical theology I got from them.
Sure.
Um, there's some other solid guys as well. I'm thinking when I go for my PhD, I want to pursue it in biblical theology. I already have an idea of where I want to go with that, but I'm keeping it here. That way, somebody else can't steal my thesis
That's
idea.
right.
Um,
That's
you
good.
know, but yeah, I would say like in terms of contemporary teachers, Jim Hamilton, Sam Amati, like if you listen to the Bible Talk podcast that's put out by Nine Marks, it's amazing stuff. Anybody preaching the Old Testament should probably start listening to that
Hmm.
because they're going to get some amazing stuff. Probably the best book I've written, single subject book, is "Who Shall Ascend the Mountain" by Dr. Michael Morales. Absolutely amazing. It really puts Leviticus in its right place and really shows uh, how the whole Torah really just centers in bullseyes on the Day of Atonement, and then how that points forward to the eschaton. It's cool stuff.
Hmm.
It's
That's
really cool
awesome.
stuff.
Very good. So now, chapter two is titled "The Philosophy of Apologetics," and then you emphasize that this is like from a Christian perspective. Not that chapter three, "Philosophy of Apologetics," unbelieving from an unbelieving perspective. What was their purpose in differentiating Christian and unbelieving in the chapters two and three of "Philosophy of Apologetics"? Before you do that, though, can you tell us how philosophy relates to the theology and all that kind of stuff? A lot of people get confused. They'll say you don't start with theology because even the idea to start from theology is kind of like your philosophy of how you should approach the scriptures. What is the interplay between theology and philosophy, and why did you break those two chapters up, emphasizing both the Christian and the non-Christian?
Yeah, so to answer the second part of that, why did I break them up? Pragmatic for pragmatic
Okay.
reasons. The chapter would have been way too long.
Okay.
You know, so and also, um, I think it helps the reader to have these as separate. Like, okay, let me just focus first on what our philosophy is as Christians. And now let's try to understand the philosophies of the various people we're going to run into that have not bowed their heart to Christ,
Mm,
because they're going to fit in
sure.
these philosophies that I bring up there. So that it was more pragmatic. Now, the relationship between philosophy and theology, I don't think we could say it any better than the medieval scholastics that philosophy is supposed to be the handmaiden of theology. I don't know if they always kept it there, but that sentiment that philosophy is the handmaiden, it's the servant of theology, right? Because when we're talking about worldviews, we're instantly entering the realm where we are talking about philosophy because theologies are philosophical. And whether philosophers want to admit it or not, philosophies are also theological. So when we're debating people and they don't share our meta narrative, right, we're speaking to them, though, in, I guess, under common grace,
Mhm.
right? In the shared world that we live in. And so all people, I don't care who you are, they organize their worldview, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in terms of meta ethics, metaphysics, meta ethics, and epistemology, right? So we everybody has a view of reality. That's what metaphysics is. What constitutes reality, right? The big questions of why, how, who, all that. And then epistemology, how do we know, right? Everybody has some sort of thoughts on how we know what we know, how we could discern true knowledge from false knowledge, and then what ought we to do? What's right? What's wrong? And so there's a meta ethics. And so when we take the theology from the first chapter, we have to now convert it into terminology that's from the philosophy that's given in the second chapter.
Hmm.
We have to take these systematic theological categories and now present them as a metaphysics. We have to take the commands of Scripture and present them as the meta ethic. And then, of course, what we know about us and our fallen state, and what we know about God and His with all of His omni characteristics, that's going to play a role in our epistemology.
Okay.
So all that to say, if we're going to have the conversation with people, the battle's going to be in the realm of philosophy, and so we have to use the philosophical categories. It's
Sure.
just the way it is, and the New Testament doesn't shy away from that. Some people will quote that verse where Paul says, "Don't be taken captive by worldly philosophy." He's clear, worldly
Right.
philosophy,
Not
which
after,
which
not
means
according
there
to Christ.
yeah, it's not according to Christ. What that stands to what that we could stand to reason then is, if we're not to be taken captive to a philosophy not according to Christ, we should be beholden to a philosophy that is according to
Amen.
Christ.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing in chapter 2.
Would you say that Christian theology and Christian philosophy are the same things but with different vocabulary? Would you say they kind of have like
100%.
a feedback loop into each other? Because I hear this all the
100%.
time, like, presuppositionalists say you're supposed to start with theology, not philosophy. It's like, well, it depends what you mean by philosophy. Typically, when we say don't start with philosophy, what we mean is kind of like autonomous philosophical categories. But that's not to say that we don't start with philosophy. It's just that we're saying that philosophy is theological and theology is
Correct.
philosophical, and they're rooted in each other, grounded in revelation, so forth. Have I got that right?
I think that's a perfect way to state it. I
Okay.
mean, we get our worldview, like what we think comes completely from our theology. And then what we're doing is we're translating it and converting it into theological or philosophical language so that we could communicate it.
Right.
That's all we're doing. But they're two sides of one coin.
So when we say theologically there's a creator creature distinction, then we convert that into the philosophical language of, hey, we have a Christian metaphysic in which there is a distinction between creator and creature. So we use
Exactly.
metaphysics, but then really we're just taking a biblical proposition that has metaphysical import and then just using it in that domain as we communicate with others in that field.
Yeah, yeah. Like, so for example, we would go to Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, meaning before the beginning, before the creation of the heavens and the earth, there was God,
Mm,
nothing else. Right. And then with creation, everything else. Now, how would we display that philosophically? Because that's the theology. We might do what Van Til did and draw the two circles on the board, right?
right.
Where you have the two view of reality rather than the one view of reality, where you have God and then you have everything else, and we could draw the little dotted lines like Van Til would, and pretty much say this is the creator creature distinction.
Hmm. Okay, cool. I like that. So now chapter 3 is entitled The Philosophy of Apologetics, Unbelieving. So in this chapter, why don't you unpack what you're trying to do? You're laying out the Christian view, the Christian philosophy, and how do you kind of categorize the unbelieving philosophy, since that can come in so many different shapes and forms?
Yeah, so truth in advertising, this idea comes exclusively from Greg Bonson.
Okay.
In his lectures, he was very, very helpful on this. Um, One thing I'll say about Dr. Bonson is he was really good at casting a net that is able to capture all kinds of isms.
Yes.
And so for the unbelieving philosophies, he said you could really reduce them all down to three categories. And then he adds a fourth that's not really a fourth in and of itself, but he treats it differently. But the three categories for sure, you have materialistic atomism, the second one is dualism, and then the third one is spiritual monism. And so, like, talking about spiritual monism, it's the idea these are worldviews that state all that exists is just one thing. Okay, but it's spiritual. So you would instantly think of Hinduism, that believes that all reality truly is Brahman, and all this is just an illusion. But reality is truly all just one thing, and it's spirit, and there's no distinction. Um, Dualism is just the opposite. You have two types of things that exist. You have um, I think somebody's knocking at the door, but anyhow, you have
If you need to go get it, I can tell a joke real
yeah.
quick. And
Let me go get it real quick.
what do you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness and an atheist? Someone who knocks on the door for no reason. That's it. That's the only joke I know. Well, I am speaking with John Feinstein, the author of the book We Destroy Arguments: How Presuppositional Apologetics Empowers the Believer to Refute Unbelief. And we've been walking through kind of the basic outline of his table of contents. We covered the theology of apologetics. Now we're talking about the philosophy of apologetics, in which Stephen breaks chapter 2 and 3 apart to focus on the Christian philosophy and kind of the different categories of non-Christian philosophy. And so he's kind of mentioning Dr. Bonson's really, I think, skillful way of categorizing kind of the fundamental categories of which all kinds of unbelief can fit. And that's where we just left off. And Stephen has rejoined us here. And so if you remember where you left off, you can just continue where you left off.
Yeah, yeah, I apologize
No
for
worries.
that.
No worries.
So dualism is the idea that all things, you have a combination of spirit and matter. Um, so there's a lot. Most worldviews are probably going to fall into dualism. Even people who say they don't believe in dualism actually do when you actually talk to them. You'll be able to figure that out really quickly. And then the third category is materialistic atomism. It agrees with the spiritual monists in the sense that there's only one kind of thing. But rather than it being spiritual, it's material, it's
Right.
matter. Um, all three of these isms are ancient. Um, Although when you hear materialistic atomism, you start to think of well, that's just modern secular naturalists. Yeah, but Epimenides and guys like that believe the very similar.
Right.
So these were all in vogue and in debate back in the ancient Greek world, and they're still here today.
Yeah.
Um, and so then what Bonson would say is he would break it down even more. Like, so for materialistic atomism, he would say you got two kinds. You have determinism and you have hedonism. Under determinism, you'll have behaviorism as one view, that, all of your beliefs, decisions, anything you do isn't really a matter of will. It's a matter of antecedent causes. Um, so antecedent causes determine what you're going to do. The other form of determinism would be Marxism. It's not antecedent causes, it's economics or oppressed dynamics, bourgeoisie, proletariat, all that kind of
It
nonsense.
reminded me of like history
Hedon
class.
Yeah, it's all fresh, right?
That's right.
And so under then the second kind of materialistic atomism would be hedonism. And he has three kinds: egoism, which a form of that would be libertarianism. Pretty much it's look, since there's no God, we pretty much do what we want. It's all about maximizing freedom. It's all about what's in my best interest.
Mm.
Egoism. Utilitarianism, that's where socialism comes from. It's all about what's supposedly the greatest good for the greatest number. And then you have existentialism, which is the idea that, well, there really is no meaning, so we get to determine our own meaning. The whole will to power. Neo at the end of the third Matrix movie when he's getting beat up. Why, Mr. Anderson? Because I choose to. So that's existentialism.
Hey, I really like how you incorporate movies because I'm a movie nerd myself. So I really
Oh,
appreciate it. It definitely helps make the connections and connect the dots. So
oh yeah. I do it too much, probably to the point where it's a fault, but it shows I watch too many movies.
there we go.
Uh, but when but when it came to dualism, Bonson said you're either going to run into Platonism or idealism, as he would call it, or Stoicism, two different forms of dualism. And then when it came to spiritual monism, you really just got Hinduism there.
Sure.
You're not going to find too many people who are opting for that, unless you're coming across like a modern solipsist. A solipsist is a person who believes that we're all actually really in a dream. In their mind is the dream master. They're the only ones that really exist.
Mm.
So none of this is real. It's almost like a different version of the Matrix. So people who think we might be in a digital matrix you might be able to classify them under a form of spiritual monism as well.
Right.
And you're going to run into these kind of people. So what Bonson says is if you think about any worldview somebody comes to you with, no matter what label they put on it, it's going to fall into one of these categories.
Right.
And then as a fourth one, he brings up pragmatism, where you have the skeptics and the sophists. They don't even care what they believe. Sophism, materialistic atomism, spiritual monism. They're like, it doesn't matter. What matters is how much are you going to pay me to solve the problem.
Mm.
Um, and so we do face a lot of pragmatism in our society, where you will face people who just don't care what truth is.
Right.
They really all they care about is results.
That's right. Yeah, that's great. And I just want to point out to folks that the fact that you just kind of reamed off a bunch of philosophical terminology is not philosophical flexing of the muscle, is actually a great way to identify categories so that you know what you're dealing with in terms of varieties of unbelief. So this person says this, okay, this person's a pragmatist, so here's how I would approach the pragmatist. Oh, this person's an idealist. Oh, okay, so these are the questions I'm going to ask the idealist. So these are helpful in terms of categorizing. And of course, if you're just starting off, it'll take a little work to kind of memorize those. But the more you get out there and you interact with people from different perspectives, they'll become more familiar. And you're like, oh, okay, I think I remember that. How do I apply presuppositional pressure to this view, to this view? And the way we do that, Stephen, is not that all different. I mean, one of the most profound things that I learned was, this presuppositional stuff works great with atheists, but like, what happens when you have a competing religious view? And the most profound answer I ever got was from a friend of mine, Chris Bolt, who used to be,
I
the
love
right.
Chris Paul.
Yeah, he used to have the Choosing Hats website, which was great. It still has
Yeah.
his articles up there if folks want to check it out, choosinghats.com. But he said that we treat the competing religious claim in the exact same way we treat the atheist. And I was like, yeah, that's right. That sounds right. And we're not using a different method. We're using the same biblical method, and we're applying presuppositional pressure to that faulty foundation, whether it's atheism, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, or whatever. So that's the simplicity of the methodology, although you can get very sophisticated pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, funny story about Chris Bolt. He nominated me to be a second vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention,
Oh, wow.
and I got clobbered. That's what was funny about it.
Okay.
I think I got third place in it, but boy, he gave such a good speech. Even I wanted to vote for me. I'm like, hey, that guy
That's
sounds
awesome.
pretty cool.
That's awesome. Well, who are you going against? Who are the other options? I don't
You know
follow.
it was supposed in 2020, I think I would have won because Al Mohler was gonna be the president. There was really no main guys, picked for first vice president and second vice president. I was kind of seen as a Mohler guy because, I was from Southern Seminary.
Sure.
But by 2021, so that convention got canceled because of COVID, and then in 2021, we had the annual meeting, and by then we had the whole CBN thing, where you had, this conservative Baptist network that was presenting itself as a resurgence true conservative SBC within a drifting SBC, and not everybody was convinced that that was a true narrative. And so you had those who supported the status quo, and you had those who supported the CBN, and guys like Al Mohler at that point, people were like, no, he's too in the middle, he's too
Hmm.
normal, and I guess I was too normal as well. So really, like the candidates who were in the main competition was the CBN one versus the, I guess you could say, the mainstream dude. And it was the same thing with the second vice president.
Hmm.
You had one that CBN put forward, and you had one that was put forward by the platform or establishment. And somebody like me didn't have a chance in that case. But I think if it would have happened in 2020, if like COVID would have never happened, I might have got it.
I,
Chris
I,
might have
I could
succeeded.
have been a contender. I could have been a contender.
I could have been a contender.
That's great.
But, politics, it works its way into,
Sure.
every church denomination. There's
Sure.
no getting around it.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, so far you've been doing great. I like our give and take here. You're doing great. Sometimes when I have a guest that I've never had before, and it's kind of like, man, I hope it's not an awkward conversation because you have people that are more quick witted, and then other people who are like, well, let me think about that, and it's like really awkward and long gaps between the questions. So I'm enjoying this conversation very much. Chapter 4, epistemology and the transcendental argument. Would you say that this is kind of the heart of the building the apologetic part, where you kind of just jump into like this is the argument itself? Why don't you unpack for us
Yeah.
the importance of epistemology and the transcendental argument, and the role that epistemology plays in transcendental argumentation?
Yeah, 100%. So, I don't think you could do the chapter 4 stuff without chapter 2 and
Mm,
without chapter 1. But when that material is firmly rooted in your mind and in your heart, then you're able to really start grasping the chapter 4 stuff. When I taught this to my church, because I teach an apologetics class on Wednesday nights, I'm almost done with it. I told them this is the part that they're probably going to have to practice the most.
Mm,
Chapter 4. You're going to want to go back and review this material again and again because it is the practical outworking of the other stuff. So first, um, the one thing, because you asked what is epistemology? Epistemology is the question of knowledge. How do I know what I know? And one thing that I bring up in chapter 1 is where Eve blew everything for us, and Adam with her, was she switched the order of ontology and epistemology. So ontology asks the question, what do I know? Right? Epistemology asks the question, how do I know? Now the thing is, since we're finite, on our own, we can never answer the question fully, how do I know? Right? And so Eve had the infinite God of the universe giving revelation to her and Adam. So when Satan, contradicted God and said, "No, if you eat that fruit, you're going to be like God. Things are going to be great." Rather than her thinking, "How do I know who's right?" She should have said, "What do I know? This is a creature. He can't know more than the creator." And so therefore, away from me, Satan, get out of here.
mhm.
And then the fall would have never happened. But instead, what she did is instead of starting with what do I know? And what I know is I'm created, and there's this creator, therefore, whatever he says has to be true. And that's the final word for me. Instead, she put herself in the position where, with her autonomous reasoning, she was going to determine what the best course was. And obviously, she got it wrong because even a sinless, finite person is not in a position to adjudicate ultimate reality. And so she chose poorly. Her husband chose worse because he was there with her. He knew better. And so then came the fall. Now we have the noetic effects of sin. And so we can't even reason neutrally if we wanted to. But what I'm saying is, even if we could, we don't start with epistemology.
Okay.
We start with ontology. For us, the question of what do we know is answered by the Bible. We know what God has told us through special revelation. And that goes back also to the first chapter I mentioned. There's two kinds of way God reveals truth. General revelation is what he reveals through nature, through creation. Everybody has access to that. But because of sin, we're going to mess that up. Okay, what we really need is special revelation, which is his direct word to us, which gives us our theology and our philosophy by which we could then interpret the general revelation. So, with that, we start with the question, what do we know? We know what God has told us. From there, we start then reasoning, okay, well, then how do I know what I know about this and that or whatever? It's always subservient to the ontology, what I know. Atheists, unbelievers of all stripes, they come at it from the opposite perspective. They put themselves in the seat of the final arbitrator of what's true and what's not.
Okay.
And so, really, it comes down to I'm going to decide what's true. How do I know? How do I know your God's real? How do I know his claims are right? And no matter how much evidence you give them, if they are putting themselves on the divine seat, whether they realize that's what they're doing or not, they're always going to come to the wrong conclusion.
Right.
They just are. Their interpretations are going to be skewed by a combination of their sin and their finitude.
That's right.
And that's where the epistemology ontology piece comes in chapter 4.
That's good stuff. I really love that. Now let's get into the application here. Now, obviously, we can't cover the entire book. I've been moving smoothly through section 1. We have to kind of skip around on section 2 since this gets into some of the details of how to apply this methodology to specific views. So let's start with your chapter 6, defeating atheism. Atheism is defeating atheism. That's a very bold claim. You'll make the atheists who watch this channel, break out in hives. But when you approach atheism and you say something like defeating atheism, how are you defining atheism? Atheists are very interesting in terms of how they define themselves. There's not like one definition. You've got the psychological, I lack belief. Then you have kind of the strong atheism, the weak atheism, all this sorts of stuff. You have the sometimes the blurring of the lines between atheism and agnosticism. How are you approaching atheism? And then can you systematically unpack your approach as to how you break down atheism, which includes the variations within that?
Yeah. So to the first part of that, I tend to treat them the same. I debated through a written debate, a blog debate, Russell Glasser from the TV show Atheist Experience.
Okay.
And he tried to say, look, not all atheists are the same, and he's given the different kinds, but at the end of the day, they all ultimately come away with the same final conclusion, right? And when I'm dealing with the agnostic who says that, well, I'm not saying I'm an atheist, like, but you're a practical atheist.
Mhm.
And they'll say, well, what do you mean? I'll be like, if you were really an agnostic, you'd be hedging your bets. Half the time you'd be in church just in case, and the other half of the time you wouldn't. But you live just like an atheist. Your life is not affected in the least bit by the possibility that there might be a God. So, really, I could tell what somebody believes in their heart by how they behave, what their regular routine is. So, you might be less bold and less arrogant and forceful in what you're saying about what you believe. But your life shows at the end of the day, you're still an atheist. You don't really give a rip about whether or not the God of the Bible is real. Otherwise, you would be doing some more some more thinking on this, right?
Sure.
So when I'm dealing with atheism, I'm dealing with it from the standpoint that they're a materialistic atomist, that they believe that the material world is fundamentally all that exists. And again, they might try to explain it in different ways here and there, but what I'm going to do from that standpoint is um, I'm going to use the transcendental argument for the existence of God. And I'm going to say, look, rather than us arguing about facts and evidence endlessly, we could get to that, because I do use evidence, but in a presuppositional way. But first and foremost, what I want to ask is, can we explain life as we experience it based on your worldview, based on your fundamental assumptions? Uh, Technically, we would say, can your worldview meet the transcendental preconditions of intelligibility? Now, that's a mouthful, right? But all I mean by transcendental preconditions of intelligibility is for us to make sense of anything in this world, all of our experience, what we see, and the world as we experience it and as it really is. There are certain things that have to be true. Otherwise, the world as it is would not exist. So, one of those transcendental preconditions would be the uniformity of nature, or Dr. Bonson would call it inductive inference, meaning you have a possible predication because the laws of nature are uniform, they're predictable, it's not going to change tomorrow. I could drop a pencil on my desk, it's going to fall at the same speed today, tomorrow, and the next day, because baked into creation itself is order, predictability. Now, we would say that also points to design, but we don't necessarily want to go the teleological route. We're just simply saying the world as it exists has a uniformity of nature. So, if you're an atheist and you believe that randomness is the ultimate foundational principle, chance, right? This universe came into existence by chance, then you have to tell me how chance, which is randomness, somehow produces and accounts for uniformity, because these are antonyms. Uniformity and chance are not the same thing. When you have uniformity, you don't have chance. You have predictability based on laws. But when it comes to chance, the dice could roll any which way. So, how can we have a universe that's based on the final principle of chance, but it's governed ultimately day by day by a uniformity of nature?
Mhm.
So, again, we could account for that because the transcendental precondition of a uniformity of nature.
But Stephen,
Yeah.
Stephen, we don't need a justification for those things, right? You're Christians that want the ultimate explanations. We skeptics are satisfied with not knowing. We can say, I don't know, and that's honest. You guys think you know, Christians, but you're just giving us your story. I mean, we haven't heard that before. How would you interact with
Yeah.
that to help folks who commonly encounter that?
Yeah, if somebody told me, well, I don't know that the Surgeon General knows what they're talking about when it comes to the risks of tobacco. Therefore, I'm not going to bother myself with the warnings or anything like that. So I'm just going to smoke. And what I would say is, okay, you're going to get lung cancer, and that's a pretty dumb way to live.
Mm.
Because the thing is, we should not be satisfied with the idea that, hey, I don't need to know. No, I would push them back on it and say, listen, you're choosing your rationality then. You're saying I'm fine with being irrational. Yet you're coming to me saying that my religious faith makes me irrational. But the fact is, you've just said it's okay to live in a world that has a uniform nature, but at the same time believe that the world's ultimate foundation is random chance and you don't have to work it all out. Sorry, that's irrational. Don't tell me you're rational then. Tell me that you're happy with your irrationality and fine. I'll
Well,
tell you that's silly.
it's not irrational, Stephen. Okay, what we see is that nature behaves a certain way. Sure, I don't know the ultimate explanation as to why it behaves the way that it does, but rabbits tend to stay rabbits. Lions tend to stay lions, and they don't give birth to giraffes. And then we kind of apply language to that. Our language describes the consistency of our experience of reality. How would you interact with that? Do you like my skeptic? I'm trying to be the skeptic
Yeah,
here.
yeah, no, you're doing a good job. And when I hear responses like that, really the person's not being serious. They're not being serious in their thinking, because what they're just doing is they're smuggling in the uniformity of nature again. They're saying I can accept nature as uniform because nature is uniform. And then all they're doing is giving me a bunch of words describing the uniformity of nature. Rabbits stay rabbits. They don't become giraffes. Things are
Mm,
predictable. I'm like, yeah, that's what I already said. All you did is repeat what I said, but you gave different examples, but
mm.
you're not answering the question. So ultimately, the issue isn't that nature is uniform. The question is, why is it uniform? And what is the transcendental, right? The transcendental necessity, preconditional necessity for there to be a uniformity of nature. There can't just be a uniformity of nature hanging on nothing, right? And they would say, why not? Well, because that makes no
Well,
sense.
maybe that's just
Um,
the way reality is, Stephen. I mean, maybe it's just.
okay.
You're saying God is the way that He is, right? Why can't I say nature?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, if nature had a beginning, right? And you don't really have too many atheists anymore holding to a steady state eternal universe.
Mhm.
So there was a point in time where there was no time, there was no universe, and then out of nothing comes everything through their Big Bang, and however they're going to explain it. The point is they're saying they don't have to have an explanation, but they offer one, right? And they, because they know you can't just say it just is.
Mm.
So they try to come up with any which way where they could say it just is, and then you push them and they say, okay, here's how it happened, right? And then when you push them back, okay, you're still saying though that nothing caused everything. Okay, well, let me push it back to a multiverse. Well, that doesn't work for a lot of reasons. Well, let me use string theory. Let me they'll just keep going, and you just have to keep pushing it to the point where at some point you have a start,
Mm.
right? There's something that had to get this going, right? I know that sounds a lot like Aquinas's first cause, and you can't have an
And
infinite
every natural
regression. And I,
theologian says amen. Amen, Stephen. I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah, and I don't want the presuppositionalist brothers of mine to say, "All right, he's out. He just he just appealed to the cosmological argument." But it's more than that. I'm appealing to it as a trans on the phone. One aspect of the cosmological argument that fits well within our system is that it goes to great lengths to say there's only two kinds of things, contingent and necessary.
Mm,
And then it goes to great lengths to define and describe what a contingent thing is. It's caused, it's sustained, and it's determined by things outside of itself, right? And so if something is contingent, it can't be self-attesting by definition, right? Everything about the universe screams contingent. It had a beginning, right? It's governed by laws that dictate what it's going to do. So, and if it had a beginning, that means it was caused, it's determined. You would assume it's sustained if these uniform laws are continuing to work as they are. And so, the transcendental linchpin of the argument is if anything contingent exists, there must be something that's necessary. And that which is necessary by definition is uncaused, unsustained, and undetermined. And if you start thinking more clearly on that, there can only be one necessary being.
mm, mm,
And so from that standpoint, I could point to a lot of contingent things. And you could say, well, they're all part of the universe. Well, the universe is contingent. Therefore, the universe must transcendentally be built or based upon something or someone that is necessary. Now, they might not like that explanation, but it's logical. And their whole appeal to I don't have to defend this really is them saying, I would rather choose to be irrational.
Right. I hear people say all the time, it's like, well, I have my presuppositions and I don't have to justify my presuppositions because presuppositions by definition are unjustifiable. And of course, that's just to implicitly deny the possibility of transcendental argumentation, which requires another argument. Give me an argument as to why transcendental arguments can't be done. So there you go. All right. Well, you have another problem, Stephen, because
Uh-oh.
the Bible, okay, the Bible is factually false because
Hmm.
we know, Stephen, we know that evolution is true and creation is a silly mythological story. Especially you
Yeah.
have that contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. You got the two creation accounts. The Bible's just a bundle of myths and contradictions, talking snakes and, all that kind of jazz. How would you interact with that? And that'll kind of be our last point that we'll discuss. Just before you answer, I want to encourage folks. In his book, he does cover atheism, evolution, the problem of evil, secular dualism and idealism, transcendent mysticism and immanent moralism, and biblical counterfeits and cults and things like this. So the book's got a lot, going for it. So highly recommend. But I'm going to put the book down here. I was using that to ask you my questions. Why don't you unpack the last set of questions there, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah. Yeah. So first, I have a second edition of the book that's coming out that is significantly longer and better in every way.
Okay.
I wrote that in 2014. I've got 2 more graduate degrees since then. One of them's a research degree, so I've become a much better writer.
Okay.
Um, I'm kind of embarrassed by my prose in the book
Oh,
that you're holding
stop.
up.
I
But
enjoyed
but
it, man. Wouldn't have known unless you said something.
but one fundamental difference between my 2 versions is I rewrote the evolution chapter
Hmm.
and expanded it into 2 ginormous chapters.
Okay.
Um, and so I've been doing a lot of study on the creation evolution topic, and really, like, to that argument, I would first require them to give me specific arguments,
Hmm.
rather than just putting it on me. I'll be like, okay, so you show me specifically what aspect of evolution that is factual, and I'll let them start talking from there. Because you would, if you were the skeptic, you would probably bring up something, and
Hmm.
then I would respond to that. But I think what I could do to help us as Christians here is maybe give a framework, so that we understand what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the evolution versus creation debate. Um, First, we should not be thinking in terms of micro and macro evolution anymore. That's just old terminology,
Okay.
right? And an atheist is going to tell you, like, nobody talks that way anymore. We should be thinking in terms of the general theory of evolution and the special theory of evolution. The general theory of evolution is the idea that you have this single amoeba, the single celled life form, and from it all other life forms evolved. And in order for that to happen, you have to have natural selection mixed with mutations, but they have to be beneficial mutations that create new genetic information. Okay, that's the general theory of evolution. The special theory of evolution is the idea, like, we might think of it as microevolution, but it's actually distinct from that. The special theory of evolution is within various uh, kinds of creatures, you will have what is called speciation. And so evolutionists will often say, here's the proof: new species do come into existence. And they absolutely do. And a creationist is being foolish if they say, no, they don't. Yes, they do. There are so many examples. I mean, just the dog breeds are example of speciation, because you can't mate a Chihuahua with a wolf, right? And we see the same kind of thing happen with fish, different kind of fish. But here's the point: the dogs are still dogs.
Hmm.
When it comes to felines, right? You have tigers, lions, ocelots, leopards, house cats. How could they all be from the same thing? They are. You might not be able to mate a cat, your house cat, with a tiger, right? But you can mate a house cat with the next level up, which I believe is the ocelot. And then you could take that offspring and mate it with the next one up, which would be like the puma or whatever.
Hmm.
And eventually you could, through breeding, you could have a feline that has all the DNA of all the different feline types. And so the Bible tells us that God created everything according to its kind, right? So, what we would expect is within each kind, you had the maximum amount of genetic diversity. Just like in Adam and Eve, you had the maximum amount of human genetic diversity that makes possible all the variations you see in us, right? And so, what happens is when these creatures spread out over the world and they end up in microclimates and things like that, they're going to adapt. And as they adapt, yeah, you're going to have new species from those kinds come into existence, such as the different kinds of cats, such as dogs that have long hair versus dogs that have short hair, and things like that, because depending on the environment they live in, um, these adaptations are going to be necessary. But here's the kicker, right? So, the special theory of evolution or speciation was first proposed by creationists in the 1600s and 1700s. And it was the evolutionists who said, no, that's nonsense. They argued for the fixity of species,
Mm.
right? But then later they realized that doesn't work. And now they're acting like speciation was their idea. And then a bunch of foolish creationists act like fixity was our idea. And they've got it all mixed up.
Mm.
We were the first ones to say this is the way that it works. And so my second edition brings that all out. Now, the kicker is this. In the special theory of evolution, whenever we're dealing with speciation, 100% of the time we are always seeing a loss of information, not an addition of information. So even if you have a useful adaptation, what's happening is something in that organism is being shut off so that it doesn't produce something that will be non-beneficial to it in that environment. You never have the addition of information. All speciation, 100% of it comes from a loss of information. For the general theory of evolution to happen, you have to have the creation of new information.
Mm.
So it comes down to information. So as that evolutionist tries to make that argument, and I say, what proof do you have? And they go to speciation, I'm first going to educate them that this was our idea. Second, I'm going to educate them that it is always a loss of information, okay, never the creation of new information. And then I'm going to say, and because of that, the special theory of evolution can never lead to the general theory of evolution.
Mm.
So you need an entire new theory of physics and laws of science to account for the existence of new genetic information coming in, because we don't see that. So I then go back to this idea, a presuppositional idea here. We have two potential worldview models. You have one tree where all life comes from that one single source, which requires a boatload of new information. And we've never even observed that once, right? Or you have our model where at the top you have completed kinds and then you have little trees branching out from those kinds. And those all stem from a loss of information. Now, when we look at the real world and all we could study, which one matches what we see in the science lab? The creationist view, not the evolutionist one.
Mm.
And so our particular worldview has the feature that I love this word. It's called verisimilitude. It has the appearance of being real because it matches reality. Okay, their story lacks verisimilitude. We don't see the incoming of new information. So that alone lets us know their story is wrong.
Mm.
It doesn't work. So again, we start with what everybody has a presupposition. If they say they are arguing just from facts alone, no, they're starting with an assumption of naturalism. And with naturalism and materialism, they're trying to imagine a way in which life comes from non-life and then becomes everything we see today. It's all an imagination, and it's all built off that ism, naturalism.
Mm.
Okay, we're starting with a different presuppositionalism, supernatural creationism, and what God has told us. And so it all starts in completed forms and then breaks down from there due to sin and the curse and all of that, right? We're both looking at the same evidence, right? We're both looking at the same world, but we're coming to different conclusions because of different starting points. Their starting point comes back from that human epistemology that they can never justify because of their finitude. And ours is starting based on what the omnipotent, omniscient God of the universe has revealed to us. And from a pragmatic standpoint, when you start with our assumption rather than theirs, we are able to explain all that is seen in this world far better than they can.
Mm.
And there's so much more that could be said about dating rocks, all that. All that gets covered in my second edition, which is not out yet. So I'm sorry to tease everybody on that, but
You're gonna
it
have to
will be.
settle for this first edition, all right? Which is good. I've enjoyed it. So don't be too hard on yourself. I'm looking forward to that second edition. I hope it is also I hope it's also going to be available on audio for us audio guys. But Yeah, that's some good stuff, man. I really appreciate you sharing, this discussion with me and walking through your book. So you have a second edition. You teach a class. So I want folks to kind of maybe you can share with them how they could access those classes. Are they recorded? Is there some place someone can go say,
Yeah.
"Hey, this guy seems interesting. I want to learn a little bit more." Is there a YouTube channel where these lectures are recorded and so forth?
Yeah, so we live stream it. And so we live stream it both, well, to 3 places, to Sermon Audio, which people may or may not know what that is, but Sermon Audio is really a repository of sermons
Yes.
from churches that hold to Reformed theology and expository preaching. So you just look up Sovereign Way Christian Church and Sermon Audio, and you'll find all my sermons plus all the classes I've taught. I taught a full Church History 1 class about 2 years ago. And I'm going through the apologetics class. I'm almost done with that now. You could also find the same things on YouTube. You would just go into YouTube and you type in Sovereign Way Christian Church, and you'll find the same things there as well. But
Sovereign Way Christian
I
Church.
prefer Sermon Audio because we pay for it, and they give us metrics and let us know how many times things have been downloaded and all that good stuff.
Okay, is it under the biblical Apollo? Oh, I see. This is perfect. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I like it. All right. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. This has been an excellent discussion. I hope that folks who are listening in will find this very useful. If you want to dive in deeper and you're like, that sounds really interesting, pick up the book. It's also available on Kindle, so you can download it there. And of course, I will let people know whenever that second edition comes out. Maybe we can have Stephen back on, and maybe we could have him back on even before it comes out again. We can cover a whole bunch of other different yet related topics. Are there any last things you'd like to say, Stephen, before we close out this show?
Yeah, just I'd like to thank you, Eli, for having me on. This was fun. I enjoyed it. When we were talking yesterday, I'm like, well, I don't want to sound like an idiot when I'm up there, but I appreciate the opportunity. This was a fun conversation, and I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, well, you definitely don't sound like an idiot. Maybe you've lost all that hair from all the reading and studying you've been doing. So I'm sure people have been blessed by this discussion, and looking forward to having you on in the near future. Well, folks, that is it for this episode. If you like what you've heard, please be sure to subscribe if you have not yet subscribed. Those who have subscribed, thank you so much. I think right now we are standing at 13,500 and something subscribers over the past few years. Very, very much appreciate the support. Click that notification bell as well for upcoming videos. And until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.